Okay, hello everyone. To be respectful of everyone's time, we're going to get started. Welcome, and thank you so much for taking time out of your busy day to join me here in this webinar. This is webinar 2 of a 4-part series titled Moving from Fear to Action, Building Frontline Workers' Capacity for Intervention on Domestic Violence. And for those of you who didn't meet me last week, my name is Sidra, and I'm the coordinator of the Immigrant and Refugee Communities Neighbors, Friends, and Families campaign. I'm also a researcher and a writer who focuses on gender-based violence. I want to remind everyone about what our vision is for this webinar series, and that is that all service providers in Ontario know how to recognize the signs of domestic violence and also know how to offer support to clients that are living with abuse. So as you know, this is part 2 of a 4-part webinar series. Last week was part 1, and we talked about rethinking domestic violence. And we went over the different types of violence and also something called the power and control wheel. If you weren't able to make it last week, you can access this webinar online. Simply send me an email at the end of this webinar and I will make sure you get that link. My email address will be available at the end of the webinar. So today we're going to talk about what to look out for. So what are the warning signs of domestic violence and what are some of the signs of high risk? Next week in part 3, we're going to talk about barriers. So what are the unique barriers that immigrant and refugee women living with abuse face? And what can we do, especially as service providers, to bridge those barriers? And then finally, in part 4, we're going to have a very interactive session with myself and an expert in the field about what to do in a very practical way if a client of yours tells you that she's living with abuse. And in part 4, there'll be a lot of opportunity for questions and interaction. It's really for you to share best practices with each other as well. Okay, so let's get started on part 2. Before I get into the warning signs of domestic violence, I want to talk a bit about trauma. Now, trauma is very related to domestic violence. And it's a very important concept to understand because if you're working with a client who's living with abuse, she may be exhibiting signs of trauma and may be experiencing post-traumatic stress. So what is trauma? We often think about trauma as being something that happens to soldiers who go away to war. Vietnam veterans are often thought of when we think about people who have trauma and veterans of other wars. But really, trauma isn't just restricted to the experience of soldiers. Trauma is caused by any event or series of events that overwhelms our ability to cope. And domestic violence and sexual violence also cause trauma. And this concept was really brought to everyone's attention by Dr. Judith Herman. She wrote a book called Trauma and Recovery, which is an excellent book that I would recommend to anyone who wants to learn about trauma. It's a very complex topic, and we could do a whole webinar about it. So we're just going to be covering it very briefly here. Now, the important thing to know about trauma is that people respond to trauma in different ways. And in many cases, these responses are automatic, meaning that we don't consciously control how we're going to respond. The event is so overwhelming and so frightening that we go into something called survival mode and have an automatic response. And many of you might have already heard of the term fight or flight. You know, do you have a fight or flight reaction? And that's related to trauma. So one of the ways that people can automatically respond to trauma is to fight. So in a situation of danger, the automatic response may be to fight back. Another automatic response people can have to trauma is flight. and that is to try to get away from the source of trauma. I heard a story from a woman who mentioned that she was hit by someone in the street, and her automatic trauma response was flight. And it wasn't until 2 blocks later that she came back to consciousness and realized she had been running. Her body took over and started running without her conscious control. Her automatic response in that case was flight. Another automatic response people can have to trauma is to freeze or to become immobilized. And this again is a natural response that can happen. Not sure if any of you have heard of how mice sometimes protect themselves from cats. Mice will often freeze and play dead. They'll become completely limp. They won't move. They won't make a sound. They'll freeze as a way to protect themselves. So all 3 of these automatic trauma responses are ways for an organism, a human, to protect themselves when they feel like their life is in danger. And again, it's very important to know that in many cases, we don't choose what our automatic response would be. And this is particularly important for those survivors who tend to freeze. If you're working with someone who's living with abuse or who survived abuse, one question that can be very harmful to ask is, why didn't you fight back? Why didn't you fight back against the abuser? Now, for survivors whose automatic trauma response is to freeze, this question can be very shaming and confusing, and they may blame themselves, like, why didn't I fight back? Why did I just freeze? And so understanding trauma is a really important piece, so that way we can take away that stigma for people whose response is to freeze or to run away or to fight, and instead just understand that they're in an experience, they're surviving something that's life-threatening, that's overwhelming their ability to cope. Another note I want to make about trauma is that people can cope with the effects of trauma in ways that might be difficult to understand. The first way people may cope with the effects of trauma is to self-blame. So if someone has survived violence, they may blame themselves for that violence. And this may be confusing. You may wonder, well, why would they do that? The reason is to get back a sense of control. If someone is surviving abuse, it's a very overwhelming experience. But if they can tell themselves that, you know what, this violence is happening to me because of something I did. It's my fault. That's actually a way for them to feel a sense of control over the situation. Because if it's my fault, then if I change, I can stop the violence. So you can see how that can give someone a sense of control. But the problem with self-blame is, though it may help a survivor feel like she can predict and control and stop the violence from happening by blaming herself and her own actions, it is a harmful coping mechanism because it's not true. The fact is that the violence is something that she can't control. It's something that the abuser is in control of and is responsible for, and it's not her fault. So it's very important when you're working with a client who's living with abuse to remind her that it's not her fault. And if she says things like, oh, you know what, I caused this to happen because I'm always late coming home, or I left the dishes dirty, you can tell her that's not your fault. You didn't cause the violence. And another way that people cope with the effects of trauma that I'm just going to talk about really quickly, we'll return to this in webinar 4, is you may notice that they are numbing or stuffing their feelings. So they may be using food, alcohol, drugs, or even self-harm to numb their feelings because the feelings associated with trauma are too overwhelming. Okay, so on to the next slide. I just want to very briefly go over what some of the effects of trauma are. And I do want to ask you all, if you would like a whole full dedicated webinar only on trauma, I would be happy to develop something like that for you all. So please send me an email at the end of the webinar if that interests you. But very briefly, what trauma can do is have a series of effects on someone that can cause something called post-traumatic stress. Post-traumatic stress, and you may have heard of this before. Again, most often we think of soldiers coming home from war and having post-traumatic stress, but this can absolutely also happen to survivors of domestic violence and sexual violence. So what does post-traumatic stress include? It can include nightmares and difficulty sleeping. It can include reliving the trauma in intrusive memories or flashbacks. So a survivor may see in her mind's eye pictures of the trauma over and over again. Trauma can also cause something called dissociation, which is when someone's mind becomes separated from their body. So they have a out-of-body experience or may completely blank out. It can also cause gaps in memory and difficulty concentrating. And this is important to note when you're supporting a client living with abuse. When you're giving her information, whether it's about resources or a safety plan or any other information, make sure that you present it to her in a very simple and clear way. You don't want to overload her with a lot of complex, overwhelming information because she may already be going through post-traumatic stress and has difficulty concentrating or remembering things. There also may be overwhelming emotions or emotional numbness. She may feel jumpy or anxious. And there may be the presence of something called trauma triggers. So what are trauma triggers? These are words, images, smells, touch, or sounds that automatically remind a survivor of the abuse. So, for example, if there's say a lamp falls in the office and makes a big clanging sound, like a very loud, violent sound, and maybe glass breaks. If there is someone in the room who has trauma related to abuse where that sound was present, hearing that same sound that reminds them of the abuse or the violence can trigger them. And by that I mean it can cause a flashback to reliving the violence. It can cause dissociation, so having an out-of-body experience, difficulty concentrating, or it can place the survivor in distress. She may feel like she's in danger and she's right back in the trauma. Another example of a trauma trigger could be any kind of touch that reminds her of the trauma. And this is where it's very important to always ask. Different agencies have different norms around, patting a client on the back to encourage them or tapping them on the shoulder to get their attention. If you're working with a client who's a survivor of abuse, even those small gestures and that touch can be triggering. So it's very important to always ask before touching someone and generally to avoid doing that where possible. If you have a relationship where it makes sense to offer a hug, and please follow your agency's policies on this issue entirely. But even before that, if it makes sure to ask, can I give you a hug? Would you be okay with that? And again, follow your agency's policies around that. I just want to make note of that because even if we have positive intentions, certain kinds of touch can be very triggering. And so please be mindful of that. And in webinar number 4, we're going to talk about how to make your agency space and your general practices that you use more supportive of survivors of trauma. And so that way you don't even have to wait to know if someone is a survivor of abuse before you take certain measures. We can just treat all of our clients this way so that everyone can feel comfortable. Okay, so that's a quick run through trauma, and it's important to keep all of this in the back of our mind when we're thinking about warning signs of abuse or what to look out for. You know, if a client seems like they're suddenly having difficulty sleeping and very jumpy or anxious, you know, you might start to wonder, okay, is this a trauma issue? Okay. So what are the warning signs of domestic violence? And that is the reason we're all here today. You know, what to look out for. What are the warning signs? And this is important for you to have to train yourself to start being aware of the initial warning signs so we can have conversations before abuse gets worse. And I just want to let you all know that what we're going to be talking about today are warning signs that will show up in clients who have not yet told you that they're living with abuse. So this could be someone that you're seeing, you feel like something might be going on and you're not sure. What warning signs can help guide you? In webinar number 4, that's when we're going to talk about what to do step by step if a client does come and approach you and tell you she's living with abuse. So that will be in webinar 4. All right. So when it comes to warning signs of domestic violence, there is a really major myth that we need to break. And that is that if a client is living with domestic violence, we'll know because we'll see bruises or injuries. And in the last webinar, we talked about this image of a woman with a black eye that is what we often think about when we think about domestic violence. But as we know, there are many different types of violence, and in many cases, we will not see any bruises or injuries, even if it's a very dangerous situation. So the fact is that although bruises can be a warning sign of domestic violence, in many cases you will not see any physical evidence of violence, even if someone is in a life-threatening situation. So what are some of the warning signs of domestic violence? What should you look out for in the behavior of a client that you have a relationship with? Well, the first thing is we're going to actually look at warning signs that may show up in the behavior of someone who is an abuser, so who is abusing someone. You may notice that the abuser puts her down publicly. So you may see him just tell her that, oh no, you're wrong, you're always wrong, how could you make that mistake? Just talking to her in a demeaning way. That's something you might notice in the behavior of someone who is being abusive, who is an abuser. You also may notice when you see them together that he is the one who's doing all of the talking. So he's completely dominating the situation, the conversation, and she is relatively silent. You may also notice that he tries to keep her away from you. So he tries to keep the woman that he's abusing away from you. He may interfere with her seeing you in appointments. He may always want to be present when you're speaking to her, not let her speak to you alone. Okay, so you may notice that he's acting that way. This is a subtle one, but very important. As we know from the last webinar in this series, domestic violence is about power and control. It's about one person feeling like they are entitled to power, control, and almost ownership over the other. So a major warning sign of domestic violence would be if you see that the abuser is acting as if he owns her, bossing her around, telling her where to go, speaking about her like a possession. And this is a tricky one because in many cases of domestic violence, the abuser may say that he is the victim and act depressed. He may say, my family doesn't appreciate me, she doesn't see all I do for her, I make all these sacrifices. So that may be part of the picture as well. You may notice that he acts superior to everyone in his home. And then finally, and we did cover this in the last webinar as well, is that he may lie or exaggerate his good qualities to make himself look good. So we know that many abusers have a very charming public personality. So he may be always talking about himself as if he's the greatest person, and being dishonest and exaggerating about his good qualities. So these are some things to look out for in the behavior of someone who may be being an abuser. Now, what warning signs may you notice in a survivor? So if one of your clients is herself living with abuse, what may you notice in her behavior? Now, one thing is that she may apologize for the abuser's behavior. You could constantly say, oh, I'm sorry he acted that way around you. He's just tired, making excuses for him. Or she may even become angry and defensive about the behavior of the abuser. So she may say, how dare you blame him? He's like, don't point out his flaws. He didn't mean to say that, and become very angry and defensive in order to deflect attention from his behavior. You may notice that she seems sad, withdrawn, or afraid. And again, when you see her with him, when you see the two of them together, you may notice that she's nervous about talking when he's around. And you might even see a difference between how she acts when he's around compared to when it's just you and her talking. She may be way more relaxed when it's just you and her talking. And if you notice that she's canceling plans or appointments last minute, that can be another warning sign. If there seems to be this pattern of her just suddenly disappearing. And also, if she avoids you when she sees you in the street or in the community, that might be a sign that something is going on. She may call in sick for work or volunteer commitments or other commitments a lot more. People just stop seeing her around as much. And then finally, this warning sign of that she tries to cover up bruises. And back to thinking about domestic violence as a form of trauma, you may notice that she's using more drugs or alcohol to cope with her feelings and with the trauma. So these warning signs will be sent to you if you send me an email at the end of this webinar. Okay, so what we're going to do now is we're going to review some of the warning signs that we just talked about, and we're going to watch a video, and this is Mary, and she's actually the sister of a woman who was living with domestic violence. And we're going to hear from Mary, and while we're listening to her story, please look out for any of the warning signs of domestic violence that she noticed. So I'll just put them back up quickly. Yeah, for the survivor. Here you go. So here are the warning signs of domestic violence for a survivor that you might see in the behavior of a survivor. And we're going to watch a video now and try to listen for what warning signs are noticed. Just going to load the video. Okay. So what we noticed from Mary's story is that Mary's sister Carol had been living in an abusive relationship. And what warning signs did Mary notice in Carol's behavior? May have seen that she notices that the abuser does all of the talking. Okay, so she was not able to really have a conversation with her sister. It was always with the abuser. She definitely noticed that he tried to keep her away from her. So he tried to keep them from communicating with each other and interacting with each other. She also notices that the survivor, that her sister, seemed sad, withdrawn, or afraid. And also that she tried to cover up bruises. And I do want to note that this is a true story, and this video testimonial was very graciously provided to the Neighbors, Friends, and Families campaign so that people would be able to understand these more subtle warning signs of domestic violence. So the final section of this webinar is going to be focused on high-risk situations. And I do want to issue a warning that this is a challenging part of the webinar because we're going to be talking about situations when there is a higher risk that the abuser will kill the woman that he is abusing. So that is what we mean when we say high-risk situations. And this is important to be aware of because when you're supporting a client living with abuse, it's important to be aware of what the red flags are that a situation is becoming dangerous. And also when you are supporting her in developing a safety plan and in getting resources from the community, it's good to have this information in the back of your mind. So we make sure that we're taking domestic violence seriously, and as the purpose of this webinar series is building our capacity to intervene. Okay, and so I do want to remind you to please take care of yourself while we're discussing this topic. This webinar is being recorded, so you can pause it or leave the webinar and come back to it at another time if you find it upsetting. Okay. So what we're going to do when we're discussing about high-risk situations is refer to the Domestic Violence Death Review Committee of Ontario's research. So they have conducted a review and research on 267 domestic violence cases in Ontario that happened between the years 2003 and 2015. And all of these 267 cases that they analyzed resulted in domestic homicide, so a murder. And by analyzing these cases, they could look back and find what risk factors, what patterns are there that we can take from these cases and learn from and say, and then predict in the future what factors are associated with a higher risk of homicide. And I can email you a full link to the report at the end of this webinar. We're just going to be reviewing a few of their findings, but their whole report is very comprehensive and very informative. So what we're going to be talking about in this webinar are the 10 most common high-risk factors. And that means that when these risk factors are present in a domestic violence situation, there's a higher risk of it escalating to homicide. Number one is obsessive behavior. So if there are any actions or behaviors by the perpetrator that indicate an intense preoccupation with the victim, that is a high risk factor. And what we mean by that are things like stalking. Okay, so following the victim, spying on the victim, making repeated phone calls to the victim, giving her a lot of excessive gifts. These stalking behaviors are a high risk factor, and we spoke about in the last webinar, and it can't be said enough, how stalking has been given a positive reputation by a lot of romantic comedies, making it seem like if someone shows up at your work when you told them not to, is spying on you, is calling you nonstop, that's romantic. And in fact, this research by the Domestic Violence Death Committee of Ontario shows that the #1 high risk factor for a domestic violence situation to escalate to homicide is obsessive behavior and stalking. So that's a very important one to be aware of. Another very important risk factor is that if there is an actual or pending separation between the couple, this is a high-risk time for the domestic violence to escalate. So this can be if the partner wanted to end the relationship, if the perpetrator was separated from the victim and wanted to renew the relationship, if there was a sudden or recent separation, or if the victim had contacted a lawyer and was seeking a separation or divorce. So if you have a client who's living in an abusive situation and she tells you she wants to leave, it is extremely important that she has a safety plan and proper support from ideally people and centers that are experienced in supporting women living with abuse. Too often we see people pressuring women living with abuse to, why don't you just leave? Just leave. And the fact is that leaving is a very dangerous time. And pushing someone to leave without a safety plan in place and without proper support in place can actually put her at greater risk. So it's very important to be aware of this issue. And actually, there was a high-profile domestic homicide in the news. Dr. Ilana Frick was murdered allegedly by her husband. And so no convictions have been made, nothing's been proven, but that is, so it's alleged at this time. But in that situation, her death happened a few days after she had contacted a lawyer and was seeking a divorce. So we see time and again this really tragic pattern. And so it's very important for clients living with abuse who are planning to leave to have a safety plan and to have support. Okay. Next is, the next risk factor is a history of domestic violence. So this history did not have to necessarily result in charges or convictions or any police reports. All it means is that there's been a history of domestic violence in the situation, okay? And it could be as simple as a neighbor hearing the perpetrator screaming at the victim or a coworker noticing bruises consistent with abuse. So if there's a history of domestic violence, that's another high risk factor. And this is a big one, depression of the perpetrator. If, in the opinion of family or friends, the perpetrator seemed depressed, or if there's a diagnosis by a mental health professional that the perpetrator was depressed, then in that case, this is a high risk factor. So if a client is telling you that she's living with abuse and her partner is very depressed, that can be something that makes you take that extra step in your mind and offer support. The fifth risk factor is that there have been prior threats or attempts to commit suicide by the perpetrator. So if he, in the past 6 months, made a comment or action that made it seem like he had the intention of committing suicide, this is a risk factor. And it doesn't matter if the comment wasn't taken seriously. It's just that it happened. So, for example, the comment could have been made verbally, been written in a letter, left on an answering machine. And the comments could be explicit. So he could have said something like, If you ever leave me, then I'm going to kill myself. They could also be implicit. So he might say things like, the world would be better off without me. And he may take actions that make it seem like he's perhaps thinking about committing suicide. For example, giving away all of his possessions, his prized possessions. Okay. The next risk factor is escalation of violence. So if the violence is getting more severe over time, and not just more severe over time, but also more frequent. So if the violence is escalating, this is a high risk factor. And this may be noticed in more trips for medical attention or an increase in complaints about abuse to family, friends, or other acquaintances. They're all important, but another very important high risk factor is that the victim had an intuitive sense of fear. So, if the woman discloses to anyone her fear of the perpetrator harming herself or her children, this is a high risk factor. For example, she may say something like, I fear for my life. I think he will really hurt me. I need to protect my children. If you hear things like that, this is a definite indication of serious risk. And it's very important not to minimize these statements and to believe women because, again, according to this research, victims' own intuitive sense of fear ended up being accurate, and women are the experts on their own lives, and they know, truly know what risk they're facing. And that's what it says here. The victim is the one that knows the perpetrator best and can accurately gauge his level of risk. The next risk factor is that there have been prior threats to kill the victim. So if the perpetrator has made a comment to the victim or others that was intended to instill fear for the safety of the victim's life, this is a risk factor. And these comments could have been delivered verbally, in a letter, or left on an answering machine. And like the threats for suicide, these statements can be either explicit, such as saying something like, I'm going to kill you, or they may be less direct by like saying things like, if I can't have you, then nobody can. The ninth risk factor that was found is excessive alcohol or drug use. So what that means is in the past year, whether or not the perpetrator received treatment, there was substance abuse that appeared to be characteristic of addiction to or dependence on the substance. And there may have been an increase in the pattern or use of alcohol or drugs. And people may have described the perpetrator as constantly drunk or claim that they never saw him without a beer in his hand, for example. His dependence on the substance may have impaired his health or social functioning. And this also includes that there may have been comments by family, friends, and acquaintances that they're annoyed or concerned with his drinking or drug problem, or have attempted him to stop his substance use. The final risk factor is that the perpetrator is unemployed. And so in this case, unemployed means experiencing frequent job changes or significant periods of lacking a source of income. This also includes government-assisted programs like ODSP, workers' compensation, and EI. That's all considered unemployment according to the definition used in this research. So here are all 10 of the risk factors that we've just reviewed that were identified by the Domestic Violence Death Review Committee as indicating that a situation may escalate to a lethal situation, lethal violence. I just want to make a note about how these risk factors combine with each other. It was found that in 73% of the domestic homicide cases they reviewed, 73%, so that's almost 3/4 of the cases, there were 7, oh, I just see that my audio connection has been lost. Can everyone still hear me? Can everyone hear me? Hello? Okay. Okay, I'm back. Okay, sorry about that. Okay, so in 73% of the cases reviewed, there were 7 out of 10 of these risk factors present. So they can happen, they occur in combination with each other. And the more risk factors you see present, the more dangerous the situation is likely to be. This is a graph from the Domestic Violence Death Review Committee report. And I just want to show you that actual or pending separation, so that second risk factor we talked about, was present in 69% of the cases that they reviewed. So again, very important to have a safety plan if a client is planning to leave a situation of abuse. Okay, so that was definitely a lot of information, and I will be sending you the slides and a link to the presentation for you to review this on your own time as well. But I wanted to make sure that you saw all of these risk factors. What we're going to do to end this webinar is take a look at a scenario acted out through a video. So this is a really amazing group of people that put together this video. It's an organization called Abuse Never Becomes Us, and the short form for that is UNBU, which is the Tamil word for love. And this organization, it was created by a group of Tamil women survivors of abuse who have created videos and information campaigns to raise awareness about this issue. So what we're going to watch now is a clip from a public service announcement they created to talk about the warning signs of domestic violence. So this is a fictional account. This is just an actress. It's not a true story. But please, as she's speaking, I would like you to look for and think about what the warning signs of the high risk that you notice in her story. So those 10 high risk factors we just reviewed. Which one of those are present in her situation? So if you just give me a moment, I will open up the video and I'll have to scroll to where this part of the video begins. Okay, and I really encourage you to check out UNBU's website and look at the full video and view their content because they're amazing. So what signs of high risk did we notice in her story? We definitely noticed that obsessive behavior, that #1 risk factor that we talked about, was present. And we also see that there was it was a time of actual or pending separation because she was trying to end things with him. And then finally, we see that he had made threats of suicide. So we can see very clearly now that we reviewed the risk factors from the Domestic Violence Death Review Committee report, that this is a high-risk situation. And it seems like a simple conversation that she's having with us, but actually we now know that this is a dangerous situation, and she does deserve support, a safety plan, access to resources in her community for women that are living with abuse. And we're going to talk about how to support clients who have disclosed that they're living with abuse in great detail in webinar 4. So I do want to open it up for questions now, if anyone has any. I see that someone did kindly tell me that the voice was cutting off. Hopefully that's been resolved now. Any other questions folks would like to type into your panel? Okay, I'll move on to the next slide, which is to let you know what we're going to be talking about next week, which is breaking down barriers. We will go over the barriers faced by immigrant and refugee women living with abuse, and then talk about what you as service providers can do to bridge those barriers. And then I do want to just thank you for being here. This was a difficult webinar, very challenging content, but I really do appreciate you being here. And I would love to hear from you. My email address is up on the screen. If you send me an email, I can send you follow-up resources related to this webinar and also a recording of it. And I would ask you to please like our Facebook page. We post great content and articles there, and you can stay informed about news related to domestic violence in immigrant and refugee communities. All right, and I'll check again, see if there's any questions. Okay. Thank you for the great presentation. Oh, thank you, Nuria. Okay, women are being abused. I was wondering why you do not, oh, this is a great question. Okay. I was wondering why you do not speak generally. All is about women being abused. Why don't you think that men are being abused? So that's a great question. And actually, the person who sent it, if you send me an email, I can actually send you a link to last week's presentation where we covered that. And briefly, the reason that we focus on women being abused, and we do talk about women as the people being abused and men as being the perpetrator, is not to say that men are never abused, because they are. Men can be victims of domestic violence. But the reason that we focus on women who are victims of domestic violence is because of the research. Research shows that the vast majority of domestic violence homicides in Ontario are women. Victims of domestic violence homicides in Ontario are women, and I think it's the number is 85% of all domestic violence homicide victims in Ontario are women, 85%, and then I believe another 11% are children. So that's the reason that we have this focus, is because of the research. And then also the research shows that 90% of the perpetrators of domestic homicide in Ontario are men. So that's the reason, because in order to prevent these domestic violence deaths, in order to make sure that people living with abuse get support, we do have to talk about the reality, which is that the majority of this kind of abuse is perpetrated by men against women. And the reason for that is because, well, we could have a whole webinar on the reason for that, but generally it's accepted is because of something called patriarchy, which is the dominance of men over women in every area of society, so politics, business, things like that. And also something called toxic masculinity. So toxic masculinity is this idea that What it means to be a man is that you should be violent, that violence is what defines someone as a man. So that's toxic masculinity. And it isn't true. You know, violence isn't what defines someone as a man. But people can learn these harmful ideas and then act them out. And so there's a workbook that I'm in the process of developing, and we talk about toxic masculinity in the workbook, but maybe it will be something to include in the webinars as well. But I will absolutely send you the link to last week's presentation where we do talk about that. Okay, any other questions? Thank you for the thank yous. Okay, wonderful. So I will just say goodbye to you here, and thank you for spending this time and taking time out of your day, and I hope you have a great day. And please do be in touch if you have any questions that come to mind. I am here to support you and work with you, and I love being able to take action on this issue. All right, thank you so much, and have a great afternoon. Bye.